So, things really started to fall apart for cities in the 1960s and 1970s. So they had been slowly losing tax base, right? Slowly losing the most affluent and also middle class elements of the city. And the general unrest of the 1960s really hurt this as well. So much of the unrest happened in cities, in the central cities. And most sort of famously were the race riots of the 1960s. So these were riots in African American areas and of these cities, and they devastated the cities they occurred in. The Harlem riots of 1964 were one of the earlier ones. I mean, there were a ton more other than the ones I've listed. And so, just go on Wikipedia or something, look up the riots of 1960s, and you'll see this long list of riots that occurred in these cities. Watts riot in LA, these are just some of the worst ones. And the Detroit riot of 1967 was absolutely devastating for the city. Many people were killed. Most of them were killed by police. Well over half were killed by police, mostly for stealing stuff, for looting. And so, they were very violent, and looting was terrible. They set fires, but the police reaction, and many cases the National Guard or the military had to come in. In Detroit, the military came in eventually. The response was also very violent. So, it was just a very violent time, and it occurred in these cities. And so, because the cities were the stage for the general unrest, especially with the civil rights movement, its more violent aspects. The racism was incredible at this time. It was just taking place in the cities, and we sort of see this having effects on the cities. And so, the most devastating riots occurred, the most widespread occurred after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April of 1968. And that's when you see the riots in both D.C. and Baltimore. And so there are riots in 140 cities across the country, I think, and it was just, there was a few things going on. There's just so much anger within these communities. And the more violent elements of the civil rights movement sort of started taking control in certain cases, and that's what you saw. And we don't have to pass judgment or anything, but it was just devastating for these communities, and had lasting effects. So here's a picture from the DC riot, and you could see, I could show many others, of just the widespread destruction of the city. So here is a nice little map of what happened in the DC riots, and this might actually be helpful if you're rereading the Sherwood to see what happened. So you can see, I don't know if you've been to DC much, but these will be very familiar areas if you have. So Columbia Heights is a vibrant community. So is U Street now. I mean, these are sort of the focus points of a lot of the redevelopment that's happened there in the past 15 years. And before the riots, these were great centers of African American culture. So these were some of the great areas that had lots of shopping, had lots of entertainment. The jazz community was huge there, and it was predominantly African American. So it was their own centerpiece of culture, and it was devastated during these riots. It has only recovered now, but it's very different. So it's mostly dominated by, the redevelopment has mostly been dominated by wealthy whites. And so, it was sort of a great loss during these riots, because, it was not the same afterwards. So you can see the U Street corridor, which is now very, very dominant in the area, and then down 7th Street, and the 8th Street corridor as well, which is now sort of recovering. But, what is just striking is, if you look at this map, these are the sort of areas that are just now coming into economic revival, and they were economically quite amazing before then, and this was in 1968. So this is how long it has taken for the city to recover, essentially. And here's another picture of the devastation afterward. And I'm not going to repeat what was in the Sherwood article, but it's just it was it was really tragic, essentially. So similar things happened in Baltimore at the same time. So Baltimore's riots happened over a far longer period of time, and actually Spiro Agnew, who ended up being Nixon's vice president in the 1968 election, was governor of Maryland during this time, and he clamped down hard on this. So he was blaming African Americans for this, for essentially destroying their own neighborhoods, and that really played well with the with the conservative crowd. And so many people think that his reaction to this, he was trying to really control these riots, and thus the reaction from the government was very severe. Was sort of there were sort of presidential aspirations in there, vice presidential aspirations in there, and so when we just look at this, the devastation was real, and it really set back Baltimore as well. So we looked at the riots. What did this produce? Well, it produced physical devastation. That was clear. But the racial tension and just fear that developed within many in the middle class, both black and white, and other races, just everyone was just afraid that this would happen again. In places like D.C., which were considered riot-proof, this just totally changed what people thought. And so many businesses just never rebuilt. And that's, and so all the money just sort of left these neighborhoods, and they didn't recover until very recently, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so finally you had this sort of, it was like this sort of, dagger in the heart to the cities. The middle class started leaving en masse, because not only out of just wanting to live in the suburbs, but now they're afraid to live in the city. And this wasn't just a white thing. That's what most people say. They claim it's white flight, but as we'll see later, many blacks left the city too. And in the D.C. area, they left to PG County especially. And we just see the suburbs at this time, in the 70s, just skyrocket in population, including PG County. And so many people in the middle class just left, and what you had left were remaining were much poorer residents, and less connected. They were less able to get financing for businesses, and so the economy suffered dramatically. And because the tax base declined, city services suffered, and you just kind of had what you might call a death spiral. Because as services got worse and worse, the tax base declined because people left, and it kept going on and on like this. And next week we'll talk more about how cities try to prevent this sort of thing. Part of what a city has to do is keep their tax base, and this affects their actions. And in the 70s, tax bases for cities were just declining dramatically. Many of them went bankrupt. I think let's see, a number of cities had to be bailed out by the federal government. New York at one point had to be, actually. And so this is just kind of a devastating cycle of events.